Hey everybody, what's up? This is your girl Tadria, and welcome to the first episode of The Sisters. And we are here to serve in your souls, to encourage, rejuvenate, and strengthen your spiritual healing, one seed, one question, and one conversation at a time. Listen, so we are going to jump right in and get right to it because I'm excited to talk about our topic today. And we are discussing perception versus reality. And we have an amazing guest with us today. Her name is Chrystal Crawford. Crystal, how you doing? Tell everybody what's up.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Thanks for having me. It's such a pleasure and just truly an honor. I'm so excited to be the first guest.
Yay!
Woohoo!
Okay, so what we're talking about today is perception versus reality. So, one of the things I like to do is in my personal life and my business life, all over, I like to ask a lot of questions because I don't ever want to put somebody in a position to where something I've said, they've taken it to heart and they just basically misunderstand the whole thing. Because as it stands, your perception becomes your reality, right? So, we don't ever want to put ourselves in a position to where we cause a misunderstanding or we cause somebody to think differently of us or themselves because they've misunderstood what we said. So let's jump right into our first question. So, from a biblical perspective, what's your thoughts on perception versus reality?
Well, perception, if we really break this down, perception is what happens when we become aware of or know or identify by means of the senses. Let me explain what I mean by that. So, what we see, smell, hear, taste, and touch affects our perception. But that's not necessarily the reality because what's real is what we cannot see. Like Catherine Kuhlman said, the spirit realm is more real to us than what we are actually seeing right now here in this world. And so, we can just look at the images that we have today, the filters, and we can look at, when we get dressed, we have the body shapers. And okay, so what we see is not real. But what is real is our spiritual condition. It's what is of the spirit realm. And so, this is something that even people who don't believe understand to be true. Okay. So, when we talk about the spirit realm, even those who don't believe know that there is a spirit realm, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the bottom line is that our perception is affected by our senses. Whatever we pick up, whatever we smell, hear, taste, touch, see, that affects our perception. Okay, what people say about us, what, whether it's positive or negative, that affects our perception. But that is not reality. What's real is what's really happening in our spirit man, what's really happening in our spiritual environment, what's really happening, what we see in visions, what we see in dreams that come from God. That is the reality. No matter what we look like, we can look great on the outside, but our spiritual condition can be something else. But that is the reality. And so I hope that makes sense because, our perception of self, that's all us. Our perception, that's all us. That's what we pick up. But when we start talking about what's real, that has nothing to do with us. And that has everything to do with God. It has everything to do with even what the enemy is doing. That has everything to do with what is happening in the realm of the spirit, whether it's good or bad. So thanks for asking that question. I hope that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And that's actually the perfect segue to my next question. So it's funny that you said that because my sister and I, we joke all the time because I personally dealt with self consciousness because of my weight, right? So, speaking of perception versus reality, I was talking to my sister one day and I was like, we're talking about perception versus reality, but what if a guy walks up to me and he's talking about, you know what, oh my God, girl, you fat. And my perception from what he just said was, ugh, you fat, like you weigh 300 pounds. But he doesn't realize that looking at me now, I dealt with being super fit, being self conscious. I'm sorry, being self conscious about my weight. But his reality is he was telling me that I was pretty hot and tempting, right? But my reality said that he was like, oh, girl, you fat. right? So first natural, then spiritual. From a biblical perspective, help us understand what it means when it comes to talking about self and the perception of self from the Bible.
Well, when we look at the Bible, when we talk about self, we're talking about it's in the Hebraic, the term is nefesh, and that means a soul, living being, life, self, person, desire, passion, appetite, emotion. And so it really runs deep. This river really runs deep because what we think about self in a carnal sense, or in the world, what the world thinks about self is not what we should understand biblically. That's your desires, that's your inner man, your passions, okay, your appetites, that's your emotions, that's the self, that's your soul, okay. So biblically, that's what we're talking about. Man is what we call tripartite: body, soul, and spirit. And so the self is part of course, what man is. Of course, man being tripartite. God is tripartite: Father, Son, Holy Spirit. But the soul, when we talk about self, we are talking about our soul, not our spirit, our soul, because that's where our desires are. That's where our passion is. That's where our emotions and our will and our intellect is, the soul. And so that's really important. So when we talk about self, we are dealing with our soul. And I think that that's so important when you even brought up that example, because the reality is what's happening in our soul. People might see us looking a certain way and acting a certain way, but the reality is what's happening in that person's soul. Are they wounded? Have they been rejected? There's so many things that happen in people's souls. And so biblically, we're looking at the concept of the nefesh. That's what we're looking at. So now I hope that has shifted our thinking about self, because it's so much more than what meets the eye. When I first started studying self, I'm like, oh, well, it's your eyes and it's your hair and it's your attitude, but it's so much more than that. This is your soul.
Okay, so with that being said, what is or what do you believe some of the misconceptions are of the perception of self?
Well, that's a really good question. Perception of self is not knowledge of self. Perception of self is not knowledge of self. So, if we look at the story in the Bible where I believe it's Matthew 16:24, and it says, "Then Jesus said unto his disciples, If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." But then in the context of that story, Jesus asked the disciples, "Well, who do people say that I, the Son of Man, am?" And so, there's so many different responses, right? Oh, you're John the Baptist. Oh, you're this. And so, we see in that story where Peter confesses that Jesus is the Christ. And so Peter's answer is given upon, of course, Jesus asking the disciples, who did people say that he was? But, then we see where Jesus then tells the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. So I say all of that to say this: knowledge of self is not perception of self. And so when people have knowledge of who we are, that's who they've heard. So when we talk about perception is, again, that's what comes from our senses: what we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we taste, what we touch, concerning ourself. And so it's really key in that story because, some say this about Jesus and some say that about. So it's what's said. That's knowledge that people thought that they had about Jesus. But Peter was the one who had perception, okay, that was not coming by way of flesh and blood. but it came from God. And that's why Peter's famous confession was so important, because it didn't come from what was put in his ear from other people. It didn't come from what the town was saying and what other, religious leaders were saying. It was coming from what God was saying. And so the misconception is that our perception of self is not knowledge of self. Whatever we perceive about ourselves when we look in the mirror, whatever we perceive about ourselves because of what somebody said about us, sometimes people say, "Oh, girl, you good," "Oh, girl, you so this and you so that," and
Yeah.
sometimes it's negative, and so then we develop this perception of self, but that does not mean that we understand truly who we are. And so I guess I should clarify that. So our knowledge of self, that doesn't come from what other people are saying about us, if that makes sense. Our
Yeah.
knowledge of self, that comes from a totally different dimension. That comes from God. So I know who I am. Okay. People know me as Chrystal Crawford, but I know who I am. Aside from people saying, "Oh, well, you're a prophet, and oh, you're a writer, and oh, you have a radio show, or you're this, or you're a TV host." Okay, but I know who I am. Yes, those are things that are, can be attributed to who I am. But in the realm of the spirit, I know who I am. Okay. And so, we have a lot of titles in this world, and we do a lot of things. But the question is, do you know who you are? If you know who you are, it doesn't matter what people say about you. If you know who you are in the realm of the spirit, according to who God says you are, he said he knew us before he formed us in the womb, right? So
Right.
when we know who we are, we don't have to worry about what people say we are. So, I'm very big on that. Knowledge of self is not perception of self, because we have to be careful of what we allow into our ear gates as it pertains to what others say about who we are. If we're not careful, we are not able to discern the spirit behind what they're saying about us. And we might end up allowing people to speak all different kinds of things over our lives, which causes us to have a false perception of self. You have to know when your perception of self has come by way of God or by way of flesh and blood. So,
And
we have to die to the perceptions of people. We really have to die to the perceptions of people, what people think we are. Um, because, the knowledge of God helps us to better understand knowledge of self. So when we know who God is, that helps us to better understand who we are and have knowledge of who we are. Does that make sense?
that makes a lot of sense. And that's a perfect segue. So we're going to back up just a little bit because you said something that was really important. And I had a totally different question for you, but you just pointed out something extremely important. And I'm excited about this interview already. Okay. I don't want it to end. So we just going to flow right now. You made a valid point. Well, you made a very good point when you brought up Peter in the book of Matthew. So being an apostle, being a prophet, how would you describe Peter to a non-believer?
Oh boy. Well, Peter's the one who was rough around the edges, and Peter's the one who, was ready to go.
Peter was a
He
thug.
Peter was ready to go. Everybody needs a Peter. He was down. He was down for whatever. If we really have to put it that way. And he had heart. You see, despite the challenges that Peter had when we see, in his denial of the Christ. But at the end of the day, he had heart. He was right there. And so, if we're explaining who Peter is to a non-believer, he's the ride or die. That's what we want in our lives. Peter was a little rough around the edges. He made a lot of mistakes, a lot that, we look at it and we're like, wow, I can't believe he did that. But because Peter had, how should I say this? Peter kept it 100. When we look at even when Peter was reinstated, okay, just after everything was said and done, after, he had denied Jesus and all of this, and after everything was said and done, and Jesus said to him, he said, "Do you agape me?" Remember, he said, "Peter,
Mm-hmm.
Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me more than these?" So his response was not, "I obey you," because Jesus said, "Do you agape me? Do you obey me? Do you have that highest level of love for me?" And Peter kept it real. He said, "I phileo you." So he didn't even give Jesus, and I'm not saying that that's okay, but we got to look at this for what it is. He said, "I phileo you. I have brotherly love for you. I have affection for you." Jesus asked him that three times. Three times Peter said the same thing. And even though Peter said that, Jesus still said, "Feed my lambs, feed my sheep," meaning he still gave him an assignment. He still reinstated him. So, if I was telling someone who had yet to believe on Jesus Christ about Peter, I would tell them, look, Peter didn't have it all together. He kept it real. He knew where he was in his heart with Jesus. But Jesus still met him where he was. And if you're listening to this broadcast right now, and maybe you're at odds with what you're going to do, you're like, man, I keep hearing about Jesus, and I don't know. They keep saying, "Come as you are," but I don't believe him. Look, wherever you're at, Jesus met Peter right where he was at. Jesus will meet you right where you're at, and he will get you to a place where he will trust you with something. See, sometimes we think we got to have it all together for Jesus to give us an assignment, for Jesus to trust us with something. Nobody is perfect. Nobody. But what you really got to do, and this is what a lot of believers have to do, is get real with where you are in your heart with Jesus. Get real with your spiritual condition. Don't fake the funk. Like, get for real. Peter was for real. He's like, "Yo, I phileo you. I phileo you. This is where I'm at, Jesus." And Jesus kept asking him, and he was grieved because he said, "Lord, you know that I love you." So even in that response, he was like getting frustrated. He's like, "Lord, you know I love you. Like, why are you doing this?" He didn't give some superficial religious response. He was like, "Look, I thought we were better than this. You know that I love you." And so, Peter keeps it real. Yes, he had the situation with the denial. That wasn't real. But at the end of the day, when we really look at who Peter was, this is why we see Jesus entrusting Peter with what he was entrusted with, the keys to the kingdom, and all of that. That's why we see that, because he was real. So
There you
I
go.
appreciate that. He was real. He's a real one. He's a real
I
one.
appreciate that. That was excellent. Okay, so you also brought us into our next question. So speaking of love, you brought up love. Help us understand love versus reality when it comes to perception.
My goodness, today. You had to go there, didn't you?
I
Well,
mean, we trying to reach
this
everybody
is
over here. We
this
got to
this
ask all the hard questions.
this is getting rough. It's very interesting that you asked that question, because first of all, when we look in the Bible, everybody's like, love is patient, love is kind, and da, da, da. But look, love is not a feeling. Love is not a feeling. For all the single people, love is not a feeling. Married people, love is not a feeling, especially when you get married. That's why anniversaries are so important, because this is not about how you feel. It's about what you didn't do. My goodness, today we're still married because I didn't do what I really wanted to do, you
Help
know.
somebody.
But, love is not a feeling. And so a lot of people, it's so interesting. They say, I just feel like I'm falling out of love, and I feel like this. You're not out of love. There's no way, there's no possible way to fall out of love, because love is not a feeling. You're out of covenant with God. Love is law. So when we look the uh in the commandments, you know, we see what the Lord says about love, and how we are to love him. So the 10 commandments, that's law. So love is law. Love is not a feeling. Okay? Love is that is our position in God. That's a part of our covenant relationship with God. It has nothing to do with how we feel. So the reality might be, I don't like what you're doing to me right now. Okay. That might be the reality. But what the world says is, I perceive that, I'm just feeling this way and da 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 da. But the reality is that love is not a feeling. And that the reality is that if you're in a covenant relationship with God, you have to honor what God says, despite how you feel. So, the world will say, if you don't feel like you love somebody anymore, divorce them. If you feel like, somebody doesn't like you, cut them off. Okay, but how you feel doesn't matter. What's real is that love is law. And so what do? We obey the law. I'm not talking about legalism and all of that, but the stoplight, okay? The law is you stop at a stoplight, okay? The law says, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy mind, right? Okay, with all thy strength. That's the law. No matter how you feel about it, right? No matter how you feel. So, that's just an example, but the reality is love is not a feeling. My goodness today. And even when we talk about, and I don't even want to go there. I don't even want to go there. But I'm gonna leave it alone because I was gonna talk about intimacy. But see, that's a whole nother thing, because that's a whole nother, that we need another show for that. We need another show for that, because a lot of people think that sex is love. It is not love. Sex is not love. It's not based off of love. That I'm gonna leave that alone, but I'm gonna just leave it right there. That's not love. And so, when we're in the world and we're sleeping with this person and that person, and then with the perception is, come on now, the perception is, oh, they love me. I just stayed the night. Come on now. I just stayed the night. We left Cracker Barrel. I stayed the night. And I know that he loves me. He's got to love me because of what happened last night. But I need you to understand, sex is not love. Even when you get married, my goodness today, because sex is a duty. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. See, now I'm getting in trouble. It has nothing to do. Come on now. It has nothing to do with how you feel. So what happens is we get mad, and then, oh, well, so and so and so, I don't want to be intimate with them. I don't want to do this. I don't want them to touch me, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but the reality is your feelings don't matter. See, this is for the mature people. Because again, love is law. So when you know the law, when you know the divine law of God, your feelings ain't got nothing to do with it. But that's why we have to settle disputes quickly. Don't let the sun go down on our anger. We have to mend things quickly. We have to deal with things biblically. So, there's pieces to this. But see, this is grown folks now. This grown folks. You didn't expect me to come out the gate like this. But this is grown folks, because we have to understand the reality of love. And this is why, when we get married and we have relationships with people and stuff like that, so many people, this is like the cutoff generation. We are so quick to cut people off and get divorced and this and the other. But that's because we don't really understand love, and there's different definitions of love in the Bible. But when we really look at the highest level of love, which is agape love, that's obedience unto God, that's seeking his will and his ways, how we feel doesn't have anything to do with it. Amen. Amen. It got a little rough there, a little bit of turbulence, but I think we landed at a good place.
We made it through. Look at that. Okay, y'all, this has just about been our show for today. We are very excited that Apostle Crawford took the time to hang out with us and chat with us a little bit. We will have to have her back on our next segment when we talk about love versus sex. So please know that that is coming up. But in the meantime, just remember this channel is about having an open and honest conversation about either your walk with Christ or why you chose to take the path that you chose to take, be it a non believer or not. Just remember, we are just somebody trying to tell everybody about one body who can save anybody. Y'all, that's our show for today. I am Tadria, and you can also call me the sister, and we will see you next time. Peace out.
Later. Thanks for having me.
You are welcome.